This is the Schlow Library podcast. I'm Ben Drain. Thanks for joining me. I just finished mixing today's episode, and I had myself an epiphany. In this one, we take a look at wrongful convictions, and one of the things that comes out is that good folks with the best of intentions can still be led astray by their cognitive biases. And I thought, what would I do if I thought I knew someone was guilty? In general, I have a comfort for operating outside the rules that feels okay to me. But the rules of due process are what's supposed to constrain some of our unconscious bias. Would I follow the rules even if I was sure I had the guilty party? Forget about unconscious bias. I could see myself consciously putting my thumb on the scales of justice, and then sleeping well that night. So this attribute I have, this thing that I'm pretty sure I'm smug about, would make me a terrible police officer or prosecutor, probably terrible in any position with real power over people's lives. This characteristic of mine that I had been proud of because, well, the brain is the source of and solution to all of our problems. This thing that I thought was a badge of honor is actually a major flaw in many, many cases. Anyway, this is all to say that this realization came unlooked for, and it happened because on these podcasts, we're just looking to explore the world, and not for any particular purpose than just to know its hideous design, its gorgeous beauty, its danger, its serenity. Enlightenment can hit you out of nowhere, so thank you for having a curious mind and joining me as we explore the world in all its weal and woe. Tim Robicheaux is an associate teaching professor of sociology and criminology at Penn State University. He speaks with us about wrongful convictions. Tim, thanks for joining us today.
Awesome, I'm happy to be here.
So in doing my research for this interview, I watched several episodes of CSI, and I'm pleased to report that the correct perpetrator of a crime is always caught, and usually in 42 minutes. How off base am I?
I would imagine that with the crimes on CSI, that doesn't happen ever, nor does it happen much like that show at all.
Yeah. So from the crime to the sentencing, what can go wrong?
What can go wrong? Everything. Just to clarify sort of where my research focus and my scholarly focus is, I don't do forensic science, but I also would point out that forensic science is that forensic evidence, like you see, let's say on CSI, is actually really rare concerning like what can go wrong. From the time the crime occurs, before the crime occurs, let's just go with that. Before the crime occurs, you already can have errors that could lead to a wrongful conviction. And I brought up the forensic science part because most of the errors that we see in wrongful convictions are based on social behavior. So there's things that are studied by social science. So the very first thing I could think of that could go wrong, I could actually rewind all the way to the birth of a person. That one of the first things that could go wrong is a person's race or ethnicity, because we know from the literature on wrongful convictions that being a person of color, especially a black male, appears to be strongly correlated with the likelihood of being wrongfully convicted. Some studies show a relationship between race and conviction, so maybe you're more likely to be convicted. But when it gets to wrongful conviction, that disparity is even bigger. That is, the racial disparity on who is wrongfully convicted is larger than any of them that we see. We see in the press now. Those differences in policing and stuff like that are small compared to the relationship between race and wrongful conviction. So what can go wrong, I hate to use it that way, but is simply the race of an individual by itself, outside of any context of a crime, can be a factor. So that's one place.
And I imagine race can be compounded by other demographics as well.
Race is strongly linked to socioeconomic status, which doesn't help in the process. For example, people who can't afford pre-trial release are actually more likely to be wrongfully convicted as well, for a variety of reasons, including that they have a chance to encounter a prison snitch, someone who'll say, yeah, they told me this. So, but if we ignore those systematic factors, race is actually a large predictor, because there is a concept in eyewitness memory called on-race bias or cross-race effect, where particularly white people just do a much poorer job when it comes to identifying someone of a different race from a lineup. So you could have a situation where someone is a victim of a crime, and they certainly, victims of crime don't want to get the wrong person, right? That's not their goal. They want the person who victimized them to pay the consequences. So they may be doing everything in their power, but simply biology, probably, we're not completely sure. There's some social components too to this, but white people just don't do well with black faces. They're in terms of identifying them. Memory, and this is a extremely robust effect. A meta-analysis on this several years ago found that it is a 50% higher rate of what we call an eyewitness misidentification. That is where a person is in a lineup and they're the suspect. So they're the person we believe committed the crime, the police believe committed the crime, but they're not actually the perpetrator. There is a 50% higher likelihood that that innocent suspect is chosen from a lineup when they are black and the witness is white, than if the witness and the offender are both white. So, and this cross-race effect occurs with other racial groups, just not nearly as large, for whatever reason. We're not entirely sure why, but.
Do you know if there's research correlating how homogenous your community is with the cross-race effect?
That's an awesome question. Yes, sort of. So there was a study several years ago that gets talked about all the time. It talks about fans of basketball. So white fans of pro basketball actually did not show this on-race bias, cross-race effect in memory. And when I say bias, a lot of people make the assumption I mean like discrimination or something. We're talking bias here as a cognitive term, one's ability to differentiate faces. And so fans of NBA did not demonstrate an on-race bias in memory, but that study was not well replicated. So it's hard to say, but the argument is exposure. The better studies have not been in the United States, but what they've looked at is individuals. So for example, there was one in France, I believe, Vietnamese children who were raised by white French parents actually showed a bias to where they were better able to identify white French people than Vietnamese people. So it doesn't seem to be innate, like biologically innate in terms of we're born to recognize people of our same race, but it appears to be innate in that we get used to certain features. We tend to just do worse at other races. On that note, thinking about how poor we are at eyewitness memory, a guy sued a clip art company because they had a picture that was classified as like something hipster. And this guy said, I never gave you permission to use my photo. And he was really upset about it. They investigated and it wasn't him. The guy misidentified himself. That's how bad we are on eyewitness memory. Children as eyewitnesses are really bad. I've had my daughter go into my classroom and describe her mom, and she sucks at it. I have students write out details of friends who sit with them in class, and I make them go to the other side of the classroom and then try to do it from memory. They're just bad at it. But yeah, so that we have people that are so bad they can't recognize themselves is problematic.
We'll take a short break and then continue our conversation with Tim Robicheaux about wrongful convictions. This is the point in most podcasts where an underwriter would appear. The Schlow podcast has no commercial interest, though, just a strong commitment to cultivate a robust cultural base in our community. As a found mixtape pried from the old couch cushions might lead you to all manner of joyous serendipity, we have a whole building full of imagination and adventure. As such, our midpoint break is supported by underwriters from fiction. Today's episode is brought to you by Nero's Neptune. Come visit the carnival tonight, featuring perennial favorites like Georgia Sam, Mac the Finger, and Louis the King. You can work the heart attack machine, or maybe just rent a dump truck to unload your head. Found on Highway 61, remember, the sun's not yellow, it's chicken. If you have an underwriter from fiction you would like to see sponsor the show, please send your advertisement copy to bdrain@sclowlibrary.org. That's BDRAIN@sclowlibrary.org. We're back talking with Tim Robicheaux from Penn State about what can go wrong with wrongful convictions.
If we're going through what all can go wrong, that's one area of memory, and also we throw the race stuff in. Eyewitness memory is one of the top contributors of wrongful conviction, and just race, that's one of them, but there are tons of other stuff that can happen right there. Little things like the amount of light in a room matters. How long you're exposed to someone, that's how long you see someone. A disguise. I don't want to tell people how to commit crime, but there's a lot of research on disguises, and it's very clear that people who wear masks on the top part of their face tend to be harder to identify without a mask than people who wear masks on the lower end. So I tell my students, if you have just a bandana, you're better off cutting holes in it than putting it around your mouth. So that's a really subtle thing that can make a huge difference. Stress. There's all these factors. We call those estimator variables because they're outside of the control of the criminal justice system. All of these things at once can influence eyewitness memory. Things that are like that a victim or a witness doesn't want to affect them, but it's all outside of their awareness and their control.
For memory, please correct me if I mischaracterize this, but my understanding of memory is that we think of it and experience memory as watching a film, as something recorded in our minds. But memories are in fact scenes which are recreated in our minds each time we experience them. And just like we can imagine things that have not happened, we can remember things that did not happen the way in which we remember them happening. Is that generally correct?
I think it's generally correct. The public very often views memory as if it's a recording device, which is very common. I believe that's true, that most people view it that way. But in actuality, it's not. We miss a lot of things. And even if it seems very vivid in our head when we play it back, we're playing back our memory of an event. That doesn't mean we're playing back the event. And those are two totally different things. As hard as it is for people to wrap their heads around, I remember this. There was a study of individuals around 9/11. They interviewed people right after, and I don't remember, it was less than a year after 9/11, and asked them these questions like, what happened that day? Tell me what you remember, who told you, all these things. And then they re-interviewed them years later, I want to say 9 years later. They re-interviewed them, and they asked them the same questions again, and they asked them how sure they were. And these people, they were certain. I'm certain. I know where I was and who told me and all that. And then they looked back at their answers and they showed them how many differences there were. So
wow.
They had the gist of it right, but they didn't have the other part. And maybe they were right the second time. Maybe they weren't right the first time, but their memories did not match.
Yeah. And when you're talking about, for a crime, this guy or that guy, those details matter.
Those details matter a lot. We're talking, for many people, life or death, literally. Someone's at risk of the death penalty over a faulty eyewitness.
At first glance, this seems to be one area of criminal justice reform that everyone can agree on. Everybody wants the correct people to be held accountable for crimes. No one wants innocent people to be unfairly convicted. Is it your experience that there is a consensus on how to move forward to make sure wrongful convictions don't happen?
There is not a consensus on that. Because if we move forward of the things that can go wrong, because that's just one, eyewitness memory is one of them. If we move forward in that process, now we start moving into system level factors that can go wrong. And that's where there's not the same amount of consensus. Say things like the type of lineup that people use. But there are two ways to present lineups. One is what's called a simultaneous lineup. We show, like that's your stereotypical lineup, like 6 people against the wall. Normally we use photographs now, but 6 people at the same time. Then there's something called a sequential lineup where you show people one image at a time, and they have to decide yes or no, is that the person they saw? Most of the research to date, until fairly recently, is shown that the sequential lineup that is shown one at a time is way less likely to lead to an eyewitness misidentification. But the simultaneous lineup is more accurate when the actual perpetrator, this is the person who committed the crime, is in the lineup. If we use a sequential lineup, that also means that witnesses are less likely now to identify people who actually did commit a crime. You can imagine that many people have a problem with that. There's disagreement on whether or not we should record interrogations. False confessions are rare in wrongful conviction, about 13% of the time, but when they happen, they're atrocious. They almost never occur without really severe police conduct that you would look back and say, why did they do that? But when it comes to juveniles who have been wrongfully convicted, nearly 70% of the time, for kids younger than 16, nearly 70% of the time, there was a false confession. People with mental disabilities are way more likely to falsely confess. And so when you're not recording this, you miss all of those subtle things. Some departments have been reluctant to record. Now, those that have said that it's been more helpful than not, but there was a lot of pushback in the late 90s as courts started requiring recording. Many departments refused. They said, we're not going to record interrogations. So that's something that easily could help to avoid wrongful convictions, and yet there was pushback.
Was that pushback due to the justice system incentivizing the closing of cases? I'm sure all law enforcement wants to get only the guilty, never the innocent. But if I'm pretty sure who is guilty, I'd prefer to have more leeway on how to get that conviction than more barriers to get there.
Absolutely. You just described what's called the crime control model of criminal justice. The counterpart is the due process model, which basically says place barriers all along the route, which is what the Constitution says to do. But I mean, with the Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, et cetera, that's the goal. But and that's what the framers wanted with the prosecutorial system. But we've streamlined it because that was before we had the population we have now. So the thought is, these police officers know what they're doing. They want to get the person who committed the crime. I mean, there are certainly cases of people being framed, but those are rare. Most people in law enforcement, detectives, they want justice and they want to get the right person. So in the crime control model, the goal is, once we know we have the person and that happens in investigation, let's just get rid of all these barriers. Like, let's have someone plead guilty so that we can avoid all the court process and stuff. We know they did it. Let's move forward. There are many cases of wrongful conviction involving false confessions that the police should have known better. And then I would say that it's inexcusable that they didn't, but most of them, it was subtle. And I would say that in all of them, they were following what's called the read technique, which is the training that most people get in how to conduct an interrogation. The process, once someone's arrested, prosecutor has to decide to try a case. And the main thing I'll say about that is that, again, just like police, most prosecutors want to get the right person. Prosecutors, among other things, have to hand over all of the evidence that may demonstrate a person's innocence to the defense. And that's because the police can use subpoena power, and police can have a warrant to search houses. Defense attorney doesn't have that power. But there have been multiple cases where prosecutors have withheld evidence from the defense. That is a category of causes of wrongful convictions that's classified by the National Registry of Exonerations is these what they're called Brady violations. There's very little disincentive to do it. It's rare that a case is overturned, but when a case is overturned, there's typically no punishment. There's no disincentive. So you have to just hope that the prosecutor is on the up and up, and most of them are. But it takes one prosecutor to not do that, and it could cost someone their life. New York passed a law that opens the door to lawsuits, and I believe to some extent criminal prosecution for prosecutors who intentionally hide evidence, which you would think wouldn't have been the case before, but it was not, and it's not the case in Pennsylvania. That's a step in the right direction, but I will say a very positive about prosecutors in this process. Several district attorney offices around the United States in the past 5-6 years have developed what are called conviction integrity units, where the prosecutor's office goes back and revisits old cases that are maybe iffy. Now, they very seldom investigate their own cases, so it's usually a new prosecutor comes in and they look at old cases. In a recent year, the bulk of known exonerations were actually prompted in part by conviction integrity units. That's what we want to see, because that means that we have prosecutors who aren't out to win. They're out to get justice, and justice also includes not getting the wrong person. You have offices that are saying, hey, this office in the past has made a mistake. We want to fix it. And they do. And that's so refreshing. You'll have police. I mean, there's multiple cases where detectives have come back years after, usually when they're retired, but not always, years after, and said, you know what, like, we messed up. Or where forensic experts who had no business testifying in the first place because some of their testimony has been really messed up, but like in forensic dentistry, for example, a dentist who was associated has been associated with at least 10 wrongful convictions now says, I should have never testified about this. Knowing what I know now, the science is not there. That's good. We don't see that a lot, but we're seeing it more. And the fact that prosecutors' offices are doing this conviction integrity unit says a lot. I mean, I really think that when it comes to solving crimes, police, prosecutors, defense attorneys all have the same goal. They want to get the person who committed, especially when it's a serious crime. They want to get the right person. They're not looking for shortcuts. They're just many times sure that they have the right person, but they're not looking for shortcuts in the way of being negligent. You don't want to give people a reason to mistrust law enforcement any more than people currently do, because that makes your job much tougher and more dangerous and makes the community more dangerous. When a police officer, prosecutor, someone in the criminal justice system can say, hey, you know what? We made a mistake and we're going to take steps to not do that again. That's what law enforcement, that's what prosecutors, that's what the whole criminal justice system should strive for. And we, as the public, I believe, should also be forgiving when that happens. To not get outraged when someone says we screwed up. Because I think that's one of the main barriers for people to admit they made mistakes, is they're scared of lawsuits and stuff like that. That we should be able to say, hey, you know what? Like, you did what you knew at the time. Let's say with how we interviewed people for interrogations. You did what you knew at the time, and that was what people thought you were supposed to do. But kudos to you for making changes. That's all we can ask for. So.
You discover a time machine. What book do you give your 13-year-old self when you go back to meet him?
So I have a Back to the Future answer, which would be anything that talks about stock prices. I would just pick today's newspaper, the stock page, and just hand it to him. I have a book that I haven't read in a really long time. I probably was 18 or something when I read it, but it still sticks with me, and I've given it to my niece. But maybe I would have appreciated it younger, at a younger age. The book's called Tying Rocks to Clouds. And I don't think that, maybe it was a bestseller at some point. I have no idea. The guy who wrote it basically just went and interviewed these great minds of the time and asked them about the meaning of life. And so it starts out where it seems like it's a religious book, but you find out really quickly that it's not. He asks also Albert Ellis, the psychologist. He asks the Dalai Lama. He interviews quite a few people, like Catholic priests, Jewish rabbis, and he asks them all the same questions. And it's just amazing to see perspective. So I believe as a Cajun kid growing up in a really, really Catholic household, it would have been eye-opening at 13.
Okay. What do you think the secret of life is?
The secret of life?
Yeah.
I would have to consult, because that's one of the questions in Tying Rocks and Clouds, and see what the great experts do. My secret to life is, to happiness at least, is, besides the people I love in my life, is to take things as lightly as possible unless there's a really good reason not to be.
Tim Robicheaux, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. This is pretty awesome.
Our poetry nightcap is from local author Jim Colbert. This is From 376I, from his book of poetry, Defiantly Blue Sky. Through the tunnel, the panorama unfolds like a brightly painted Chinese fan. Gold scaffolding of the bridgework framing the point and downtown buildings. I lived over there, I say out loud, although there is nobody else in the car. My arm gestures a gentle north, past the Allegheny and the stadium, as I ease the car into the far right lane, following the signs from Monroeville. I lived over there, a series of Northside apartments and a series of art school roommates, rooms bursting with promise and regrets. Further along, Route 22 is much the same. Businesses and landmarks changed, but chalky memories still sprinkled along the road, like Jimmy's on ice cream. Jean and Boots, the Cheese House, the adult bookstores, Dean's Diner. The traffic still bottlenecks between Wendy's and McDonald's, and I never passed that turnoff without thinking of the 1969 Firebird convertible, left to the elements, weeds filling the wheel wells, no doubt filled with promise and regret. This podcast is produced by Schlow Library. Special thanks to Tim Robicheaux for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about wrongful convictions in the U.S., a link to the National Registry of Exonerations is in the show notes. You can check out all the stuff Schlow Library has going on at schlowlibrary.org. That's SCHLOW library.org. I'm Ben Drain, your old friend and erstwhile companion. Take care until we meet again.